Now it's time to put the binding on our quilt. A binding is used to cover the 3 raw edges of your quilt, the top, the batting, and the backing. You can use your binding as a design element. You could choose a contrasting color, you could use a print. Choose something fun. Don't feel like you have to be restricted to using the same color on the backing for the binding. So right now I'm going to show you first how to cut your binding, and then we'll show you how to sew it on. Now that we've decided on our binding color, the next step is to cut 3-inch wide strip to use as the actual binding. First, we're going to fold the fabric. Sometimes to get your fold straight, we use our ruler to pop out the fold. Want to make sure we have all the wrinkles out of the fabric before we begin cutting. If you leave a wrinkle inside your binding, you'll have a crooked cut. Next, line the bottom up with your ruler and grab your 3-inch ruler. If you don't have a 3-inch ruler, you can use a 3.5-inch ruler. You just have to know where you're cutting. 3-inch makes it really easy. First, I'm going to cut off the selvage edge. And again, I open that up to make sure everything is even. Next, we start cutting our 3-inch strips. Now these strips are ready to be used as binding. How many inches of binding do you need? The formula is quilt width plus the quilt length times 2 plus 20. For example, if you have a quilt that is 60 inches wide by 80 inches long, 60 plus 80 equals 140, times 2 equals 280, plus 20 equals 300. In this example, you'll need 300 inches of binding. There are 2 ways to determine how many strips of fabric you'll need to cut. The first way is to divide the length of your strips into the total length needed and round up. For example, if your fabric length is 72 inches, divide 72 into 300. That'll give you 4.16. Round up 5 strips. The second method is to cut the number of strips needed per side. This method may result in fewer seams on each side, but may require more fabric. If your binding strips are shorter than your quilt edge, you'll need to put 2 of them together. To do that, you're going to use a mitered seam. Stack them up just like this. Good side, and the good side is here. So the good sides are facing. We are going to sew from here to here. You can either mark this line with a ruler and a pen, or you can freehand it. Your needle should go in right at the junction, and it should come out on the other junction. After you have your seam, you're going to take your scissors, and you're going to cut the excess fabric off, leaving about 1/4 inch. When you open it up, you'll have your mitered seam. Next, I grab a couple pins and I pin this open. And then I pin it like that, because we're going to be folding the strips when we sew them on. If I didn't pin the seam down, it may become lumpy in your binding. By pinning it down, you can assure yourself that it'll be nice and smooth. And then I pull my pin out and repin it in its folded position. I go to the back pin and I pull that out and I repin it. Now that seam will lay flat while I sew it in. When you bind your t-shirt quilt, you're going to first bind your left side and then the right side. Each side will get 2 passes through the sewing machine. Then we'll bind the bottom and the top side. And again, those will also get 2 passes through the sewing machine. We're going to bind the quilt in 2 passes. On the first pass, we're going to use just a standard foot. We're going to set up our seam allowance so the seam is about 3/8 of an inch from the edge of the quilt. On our second pass, we'll use the stitch and the ditch foot. This time, the needle will be straight up and down inside the foot. You will need to experiment with your sewing machine to know where to set it so it's 3/8 of an inch in from the edge of the quilt. Once you know where you need your needle to be, you'll be ready to start practicing the first pass of the binding. I have my quilt folded in an accordion method, so the top is right there. This is the top right, and this is exactly where I'm going to start my quilting. The rest of the quilt is on my table off to the edge. So I position my quilt so it's nice and flat. I don't want it wrinkled and all the quilt on top of me. I really need it just flat so I can access it easily. Next, I grab my binding. I'm going to be folding this binding in half when I make the first round. So then it's 1.5 inches. Some people prefer to iron their binding. I have found that there's absolutely no difference if your binding is ironed or unironed. So you can just save yourself the ironing and go straight to binding. So I lay my quilt out flat, and my raw edges are going to be lined up perfectly with the raw edge of the quilt. And I'll be sewing about 3/8 of an inch in from the edge. I line up the edge of the quilt and the binding with the edge of the presser foot. And then I'm ready to sew. I sew until this finger hits the sewing machine, and then I stop and reline everything up. My hand is stuck at this position and everything is smooth, and I sew until this hand hits my sewing machine. Continue sewing until you hit the bottom of your quilt. As I'm sewing, I'm not pulling the fabric through, I'm letting the machine turn the fabric through. As I work, I keep flattening out my quilt so I can have good access to where I'm sewing. When you get to the end of your quilt, take it out of the sewing machine, and then I cut level with the bottom of the quilt. That's the end of the first pass on the right-hand side of the quilt. Once you get to the bottom of your right-hand side, pull the quilt back so you're back at the top, ready for round number 2. The first round was easy. This is the hard part that's going to take a lot of practice. What we do is we bring the binding around to the back of the quilt, and then we catch that back from the front. That's the tricky part. You want to be able to keep it nice and even, and you want to make sure you always stay on your binding. This takes practice. So, to begin, I never use any pins, and that's how you want to practice. If you use pins, it's going to be crooked. So I start by only lining up about 3 to 4 inches. I feel with my fingers and make sure that I can feel the back through the front binding. Your stitch in the ditch foot has a little guide that's down the center. We use this guide to travel right along the edge of the binding. It guides the needle so that the needle sews right on the inside, on the t-shirt side of the binding, and not on the binding. If you don't have a stitch in the ditch foot, binding a t-shirt quilt with this method will be more difficult. So I line my foot up, and I line about 3 to 4 inches up. Bring it under my sewing machine, and I have that guide lined up right along the edge of the binding. I grab my threads, and I start sewing. I sew about 1 inch. Then I stop, put my needle down, and then I set up my next 6 to 8 inches. So I'm folding this over, running my finger under here, folding it back over, running my hand and my finger together to make sure everything is lined smooth. As soon as my finger hits the sewing machine, I stop and reline up. I also check and make sure that my seam looks good. And then I go do another section. Let me show you what I'm doing underneath the quilt so you can see better exactly what I'm trying to get smooth. What I'm doing when we're back here on the back is I'm making sure that these layers lie smoothly against the top of the binding. If it's folded like this, you're going to have the batting or the top of the quilt showing. So it's really important that you use your finger and smooth that down, and then when you turn your binding around, sometimes if you turn your binding around, this will pop out again. So you're running your finger underneath here, and you're trying to make sure this is parallel, even, nice and smooth, and then you turn your hand over, you're going to grab it with your fingers, and then I'm going to use my other hand to do a double check where I'm going to follow along right there and make sure it's perfect. I have not moved this hand, and I'm not going to move it until it hits here. After 25 years, I can bind a king-size quilt in about an hour, but if you practice, you can do it. As I'm sewing, notice where my needle is and where my guide is. On the t-shirt right along material. The edge. I'm not sewing on the binding, I'm sewing on the t-shirt material. Watch this finger. I'm using this finger as a pin, and it's holding down and not letting that fabric move as I get to the end of the quilt. When you're done, now you have to check it and see how you did. Once you finish sewing that second pass, it's time to proof your work. I use my hands and my eyes, and I just go along and make sure that everything is even and looks good. I want to make sure that I haven't fallen off. I don't want to make sure that nothing's sticking out from underneath. And that one looks good. If you have an error, you'll have to go in and take that error out and re-sew it. I try to overlap my stitches about 4 to 5 stitches at the beginning and the end of the re-sew that you do. Now it's time to sew your other side. Now I have the right and the left sides of my quilt bound. The first thing I need to do is refold the quilt. It doesn't matter if I sew the bottom or the top next. We just need one of the two. Refolding the quilt will make your life a lot easier. Next, on each the top and the bottom, we'll do 2 more passes. We're going to start with the first pass, which is just like the first pass on the sides, but a little bit different. The difference is how we fold and start the seam. All right, let's do pass number 1 on the bottom of the quilt. Start with your binding, fold it in half like you did before. Pick up your quilt, and you're going to wrap your binding around the end of the other binding. Now it's important that you don't wrap too tight or too loose. If you wrap too tight, you're going to get a tuck. If you wrap too loosely, you're going to have your binding extending beyond the end. So you want to wrap just perfect. Not too tight, not too loose. Bring it over to your sewing machine. Hold. And we're only going to go a few inches. Put your sewing machine in its down position. And now you can move your quilt around and line up for the rest of the seam. That's what it'll look like on the back after it's sewed down. Now that we're approaching the end of the seam, we need to do a similar wrap at the bottom as we do the top. But you can see I have way too much fabric, so I need to cut this off. I give myself about that much, about 1 inch to 1.5 inches fabric to roll around. So I'm going to keep on sewing until I'm almost to the end. And then I'm going to gently roll this around. Feeling with my fingers, I want to make sure that it's not too tight or too loose. It needs to be just right. There's pass number 1. Now it's time to do our second pass on the bottom. This is what it's going to look like before you start that pass. And that's what your back will look like. First thing I want to do is trim out some of the excess fabric in there. It'll make folding easier. Next, I pull this up. That's what it'll look like on the back. Now comes the tricky part. You need to fold this down. You want to have it come in so it's at a little bit of an angle, because if you have it sticking out, it'll show. You want to fold it just a little bit and pull it around here, and then you're going to sew right along there. I only am grabbing just about 2 inches, and I take it up to my sewing machine. Hold my tails back. I'm taking a few really tiny stitches by holding onto my material a little bit. Now the rest of the seam is just like we did on the left and right side until we get to the bottom. So let's check and see how we did. It looks pretty good. We got that caught right there, and we didn't have any raw fabric showing. We're approaching the corner, and we need to do the same type of maneuver we did at that corner on this corner. So first, we're going to cut off a little bit of the excess fabric. Doesn't take a lot. Next, push that down with your thumb so it comes down at an angle, and then you're going to fold it over. Still have to make sure everything's lined smooth. And then I go along and make sure I've got everything caught. At the other end, I took a lot of little stitches when I first started the seam. This time, I'm actually going to go forward and backwards. Now we have to do two things. We first have to fix our corners, and then we have to proof ourselves. So let's start with the first corner that's right next to us. You're going to come in and you're just going to cut your string short, top and bottom. Then we grab fray check, and we're just going to put a little bit of fray check right along the stitches on the border. And now we're going to proof our work. Looks good. So now again, I need to clean this corner up. Clip, clip, fray check, and they'll never come undone. So that's the bottom. Now I have one more side to do, and then we're almost done with our quilt. Now that you've finished binding your quilt, you're almost done. You have one more step, and we'll talk about that in our next video.